New details tonight in a horrific discovery of a Thibodeau girl found severely burned, shot, and molested, police say, by her own family members.
April 20th, 2024. A horrifying discovery is made after a reckless car crash in Baytown, Texas. First responders expect a routine accident, but what they find is far from routine. A girl, barely 15, lies crumpled on the pavement, her skin scorched, her breath shallow, her body riddled with bullets. Shot in the chest, shot in the face. Third and fourth degree burns covering over 30% of her body. Her wounds, untreated for weeks. Her pain, unimaginable. The only thing more terrifying than her injuries is the story she cannot yet tell. In all my year, I have never seen anything like this. Who did this to her? And why? Authorities quickly take two people into custody, a man and a woman, a couple, the very people who should have been her protectors, the very people she should have been able to trust. As the investigation unfolds, the details will become almost too much to comprehend. Months of torment, beatings, starvation, agony, and still, even as she lay dying in that wrecked car, there were secrets left untold. But this isn't just one case. This isn't just one victim. This is a chilling reminder of a horrifying reality, one that many refuse to believe. According to child abuse reports, nearly 5 children die every day at the hands of those who are supposed to love them. More than 600,000 cases of child abuse are reported in the United States each year, and countless others go unnoticed. Right now, as you listen to this, there are children in unimaginable pain, hidden behind the very doors we pass by every day. Could this be happening in your neighborhood? Could it be happening right now to someone you know? It's easy to think that monsters only exist in the dark corners of the world, but the truth is, they often live right next door. The worst case of child abuse investigators have ever seen. She was left untreated, suffering for months. A case so disturbing, even the most seasoned detectives were left shaken. What could drive someone to commit such unimaginable cruelty? What makes a person look a child in the eyes and choose pain over protection? And the most haunting question of all, how many more victims are out there, hidden behind closed doors, waiting for someone to notice? The truth behind this case will leave you speechless. But before we unravel the horrifying details, ask yourself this. If this happened in your town, or to some relating to you, would you have seen the signs? If you're gripped by this story and want to hear the full truth behind what happened next, subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that need to be told, because sometimes the darkest truths are the ones closest to home. It was just after 11 p.m. on April 20th, 2024, when dispatchers in Baytown, Texas received the first frantic calls. Moments later, on a quiet service road near the interstate, it did. A single vehicle, a beat-up sedan, veered off the road, slammed into a drainage ditch, and came to a sudden, violent stop. But what first responders found inside that car was far worse than a simple crash. When officers arrived at the scene, they expected the usual, minor injuries, maybe a drunk driver. But as they peered into the shattered windows of the car, they froze. In the back seat was a teenage girl, barely conscious, her body slumped awkwardly against the door. Her skin was charred and peeling, covered in third and fourth degree burns. Her clothes were soaked with blood, and her face was swollen and disfigured from what appeared to be multiple gunshot wounds. One to the chest, another directly to the face. And then there was the smell, a sickening mix of burnt flesh, infection, and decay. It was clear these injuries weren't fresh. They had been festering, untreated, for weeks. You could hear a paramedic's shaky voice over the radio. This is bad. We need immediate medical evacuation. Child in critical condition, multiple GSWs and severe burns. But the nightmare didn't end there. In the front seats were 2 adults, Latonya Harris, 40 years old, Terrence Washington, 41. Both appeared disoriented but unharmed, a stark contrast to the girl barely clinging to life in the back seat. "You're under arrest. Step out of the vehicle now." As officers pulled them from the car, their behavior raised immediate red flags. They were nervous but not panicked. Neither asked about the girl in the back seat. Neither showed concern. And then, officers made another chilling discovery. Huddled in the far corner of the back seat was another girl, a 10-year-old, wide-eyed and trembling. Unlike the older girl, she was physically unharmed. But her eyes told another story: fear, trauma, silence. She wouldn't speak at the scene, but when she finally did, her words would reveal the unimaginable truth behind what had happened. The lead paramedic at the scene, a veteran with over 20 years of experience, would later say it was the worst case he had ever seen. The paramedic: "I've seen a lot in my career, but this wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just abuse. This was deliberate. Someone wanted that girl to suffer, and they didn't stop until they thought she was dead." The girl was rushed to the nearest hospital, her life hanging by a thread. Doctors would later say that it was a miracle she survived the journey. But while medical teams fought to save her, investigators began piecing together the horror that had unfolded long before that crash. But who were these people? And how did a 15-year-old girl end up in this unimaginable state? Investigators were about to uncover something truly horrific, something far worse than they ever anticipated. The answers lay in the bloodied past of Latonya Harris and Terrence Washington, and the truth would be more disturbing than anyone could imagine. Then detectives discovered something that made their blood run cold. The moment Latonya Harris and Terrence Washington were taken into custody, investigators knew this was no ordinary case. A girl barely alive, burned beyond recognition, riddled with bullets, and left to suffer for weeks. This wasn't just violence. This was systematic torture. But the question remained: why? What could drive someone to such unrelenting cruelty? And how had it gone unnoticed for so long? Inside the interrogation room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Washington sat first, his hands shackled to the metal table, his gaze darting nervously around the room. His breathing was shallow, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Finally, he spoke. "It was an accident," he mumbled. "The gun, it just went off." The detectives exchanged a glance. They had seen this before. The first lie. An accident? That's what he wanted them to believe? But nothing about this girl's injuries, the burns, the scars, the untreated bullet wounds, suggested a single moment of carelessness. This was intentional, deliberate, calculated. Detectives leaned in. An accident? Then explain the burns. Washington shifted in his seat. That was Harris," he said quickly, throwing his girlfriend under the bus. "She did that. She said the girl was lying about me, that she needed to be punished." The officers watched him closely, a convenient excuse, shifting the blame. But even if Harris had played her role in this brutality, Washington was far from innocent. He had confessed to sexually abusing the girl for months. And that wasn't all. He had admitted to shooting her twice. The first time, he said, it was an argument. "I was holding the gun, and it just went off." But the second time, he had no explanation. 2 gunshots. The victim had survived both. Neither wound had ever been treated. Detectives knew they were being fed half-truths, but every small admission was another step toward unraveling the full story. "Okay," a detective said, his voice even. "Let's talk about the house." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Washington stiffened. Harris, who sat in a separate room, flinched at the mention of it. Because if there were still any doubts about what kind of evil had taken place, they would soon be erased. The search of their home in Thibodaux would provide more answers than either suspect was willing to give. And what the investigators found inside was the kind of horror that even the most seasoned detectives struggled to process. The air inside was thick, a suffocating mix of decay and something foul. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Not just the unmistakable stench of infection, but something worse, something rotting. As officers moved deeper into the house, the evidence of cruelty was everywhere. Bloodstains smeared the walls, some old, faded to a dull brown. Others were fresh. In one of the rooms, the mattress was gone. Instead, there were only burn marks on the floor, the place where, investigators would later learn, the girl had been set on fire. One of the forensic specialists took a deep breath before opening a closet door. Inside, something glistened under the light of the flashlight, a plastic container. When the officer knelt down, a putrid wave of infection and decay hit his nose. He turned his head, trying not to retch, before finally looking inside. And there it was, a collection of bloodied rags and bandages, soaked through, some stiff with age, pieces of burned skin melted into the fabric. This was how they had treated her wounds. No hospitals, no doctors, just rubbing alcohol and old rags. This wasn't just abuse. This wasn't just neglect. This was torture. And the worst part? They hadn't even tried to hide it. It had all been sitting there, right inside the house, the scene of unimaginable suffering, waiting to be uncovered. Back in the interrogation room, detectives confronted Washington with the findings. We found the blood, the rags, the burn stains. We know what you did. For the first time, he had nothing to say, because at this point, the house spoke for itself. But it wasn't just forensic evidence that sealed their fate. It was the testimony of the 10-year-old girl, the one who had been in the car, the one who had witnessed it all. I woke up, and she was on fire. Detectives leaned in. Who was the girl? She was screaming. A pause. Who did this to her? Latonya. She poured something on her. Then she lit it. And then what happened? She was crying, and she said she was sorry. She was sorry for what happened. But Latonya just watched. The room fell completely still, because now there were no more excuses, no more lies. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just abuse. And that's when detectives learned the truth. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a house of horrors. Shocking, right? But we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button to follow this investigation as it unfolds. You won't believe what investigators uncover next. At first, Washington stuck to his story. It was an accident, he repeated, his voice hollow. The gun, it just went off. But then as detectives began pressing harder, he changed his story. It was Harris. She did it. She's the one who set her on fire. Detectives leaned in. She blamed the girl. For what I did, he continued, eyes darting between the officers. She wanted to punish her. She thought she deserved it. For the first time, Washington had admitted to his abuse of the girl. Months of torment that left permanent scars, both visible and unseen. But now he wanted them to believe he had no part in the final acts of cruelty. She did it, he said again, his voice barely a whisper. Harris poured the alcohol. Harris lit the fire. Harris had her own version of events, and it was nothing like Washington's. He's lying, she scoffed. He did everything. I tried to stop him, but her words lacked conviction. Her demeanor was cold, detached. No tears, no remorse. Just calculated silence. Detectives studied her. Was she telling the truth? Or was she simply just as guilty? Just as monstrous? Who were these people? To understand what happened, investigators had to understand who Harris and Washington really were. Psychologists studied their behavior, their responses, their pasts. And what they found was deeply disturbing. Terrence Washington, a manipulative predator. He had a history of dominating and controlling those around him. Though he had no prior convictions, there were whispers, people from his past who later spoke about his unsettling nature, his obsession with power. Men like Washington thrive on control. They don't just harm others. They manipulate them, twist reality, until the victim begins to question their own existence. He had groomed the girl for months. He had isolated her. He had made her believe that she was nothing more than an object to be used, discarded, and destroyed. She wanted it, he muttered at one point. She didn't say no. Detectives visibly tensed. The sheer lack of remorse. The casual way he spoke about the suffering of a child. It was textbook psychopathy. Then there was Harris. Was she a willing accomplice? Or had she been a victim of Washington's manipulation? Her past was complicated, but did a tragic history excuse the unspeakable things she had done? Many people experience hardship. Many people experience abuse, but they don't all turn into monsters. The fact is, Harris made a choice, and that choice was to stand by as a child was tortured. She had not only enabled the abuse, she had participated in it. She laughed when she burned her. She laughed. A mother figure, a caregiver, a woman who should have protected the girl. Instead, she became one of her greatest nightmares. Authorities are calling this one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse and torture they have ever seen. A case so depraved, so inhumane, that even seasoned investigators are struggling to process it. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first case of its kind. From Sylvia Likens in the 1960s, to Gabriel Fernandez in 2013, to countless other victims whose names never made the headlines, this case was part of a disturbing pattern. These cases follow the same horrifying cycle: a vulnerable child, a manipulative predator, an enabler, and a world that doesn't see the signs until it's too late. But why? Why do some people commit such monstrous acts? What is it that separates a regular person from someone capable of this? Was it power? Was it resentment? Was it simply evil? Or was it something deeper, something inside them that had always been waiting to surface? Imagine waking up one morning and realizing someone close to you had been lying all along. What would you do? The truth behind Washington and Harris was worse than anyone could have imagined, because as investigators dug deeper, they realized that this wasn't just a case of abuse. This was something far worse. This case only gets darker. Subscribe now and stay with us as we dive into the terrifying evidence that investigators uncover. You won't want to miss what's coming next. For months, the case against Latonya Harris and Terrence Washington had been building. Investigators had pieced together the horrific details: the burns, the gunshot wounds, the abuse, the manipulation. Prosecutors were armed with overwhelming evidence. The charges? Devastating. Attempted first-degree murder, molestation of a juvenile, obstruction of justice, multiple counts of second-degree rape. And those were just the beginning. The courtroom was packed. People had come from across the state, desperate to see justice served. The media had labeled them monsters, a term that, even after all that had been revealed, still didn't seem to capture the true depth of their evil. But would the law see them that way? The prosecution did not hold back. They described in excruciating detail the suffering the victim endured. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you are about to hear is the story of unimaginable cruelty. A child, tortured, burned, shot, and left to rot. And yet, even after enduring what no human should, she was forced to carry the burden of her suffering in silence. These two defendants, these two so-called caretakers, are the reason she may never have a normal life again. But today, we have the power to ensure that they never hurt another innocent soul. Forensic experts took the stand, describing the horrifying extent of the girl's injuries. The burns covered over 30% of her body. These were not accidental. The pattern of the burns suggests an accelerant was used, poured deliberately and ignited. The pain would have been unimaginable. Then came the testimony from Child Protection Services, who revealed Washington's previous history of abuse allegations, cases that had slipped through the cracks. This case is a failure of the system. This child should have been saved long before she ended up in that car, barely clinging to life. The jury listened in stunned silence as officers recounted what they found inside the Thibodeau home. It wasn't a home, it was a house of horror. The walls told the story of what happened in there. The blood, the burned stains, the stench of decay. This wasn't an isolated moment of violence. This was a pattern of pure, systematic evil that went on for months, maybe years. And yet, neither defendant showed an ounce of remorse. When asked if he had anything to say, Washington simply smirked. "I ain't got nothing to say." Harris, when asked why she did it, just shrugged. She lied about him. She had to learn. The jury deliberates. The evidence was damning. The testimonies were undeniable. The outcome seemed clear. And yet, everyone held their breath as the jury filed back in. The verdict was about to be read. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The entire courtroom held its breath. On the charge of attempted first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of molestation of a juvenile, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. And on it went, one guilty verdict after another. Until finally the judge looked up from the papers in his hand, his gaze piercing through the silence. Given the severity of these crimes and the irreparable damage inflicted upon this child, I see no reason for leniency. These sentences will be served consecutively. The defendants will never walk free again. The courtroom erupted. Some people cried, not out of sadness, but relief. Others just stared at the two people who had inflicted so much horror, trying to comprehend how such evil could exist. Justice has been served, but nothing will ever undo what was done to that little girl. Do you think the punishment fits the crime? Should they have faced even worse consequences? Let us know in the comments. The trial was over. Justice in the eyes of the law had been served, but for the investigators, the prosecutors, and even the public, the story wasn't over. Because one question haunted everyone who had come into contact with this case. Why? Why would Terrence Washington and Latonya Harris inflict such prolonged, unimaginable suffering on a child? What twisted desires, deep-seated resentments, or psychological scars drove them to commit such cruelty? And perhaps more disturbingly, was this their first time? Did they ever show remorse? Throughout the trial, both Washington and Harris had shown little more than indifference. No apologies, no signs of guilt, no remorse. Even as the horrifying details of their crimes were laid bare in court, the burns, the gunshot wounds, the emotional scars, they sat there unmoved. It's not just that they didn't care, it's that they didn't believe they did anything wrong. This level of detachment isn't common. It's indicative of something much deeper, a fundamental lack of empathy. For Washington, the trial seemed like an inconvenience, a mere formality before his inevitable incarceration. When asked by the judge if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply shrugged and muttered, "I don't care. Do what you want." Harris, on the other hand, displayed a different kind of detachment. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't angry. She was empty. When the prosecution asked why she had set the girl on fire, her response was chilling in its simplicity. She lied about him. She needed to learn. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt, just cold, matter-of-fact cruelty, as if what she had done was somehow justified. Psychiatrists who examined both Washington and Harris found startling patterns in their behavior. Terrence Washington was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, commonly associated with psychopathy. He exhibits classic traits of a manipulative predator, one psychologist explained. He lacks remorse, has a history of deceit, and shows no regard for the suffering of others. To him, people are tools to be used and discarded when no longer useful. But Harris's psychological profile was more complex. While she displayed signs of codependency and emotional instability, experts debated whether she was simply an enabler or if she was equally sadistic. It's easy to label her as just another victim of Washington's manipulation, but the facts tell a different story. She didn't just stand by, she actively participated. She made choices, and those choices were rooted in cruelty. As investigators dug deeper into Washington's and Harris's past, a chilling possibility emerged. Were there other victims? Washington had a history of suspicious relationships with minors, cases that had been reported but never fully pursued due to lack of evidence or witnesses too afraid to testify. There were whispers. People came forward after the fact, saying they'd always suspected something was off about him, but without solid proof, there wasn't much we could do. And then there was Harris. Her past was murky, filled with troubled relationships and instances of unexplained injuries in children she had once cared for. But no one had connected the dots until now. The investigators were left with a haunting realization. This might not have been their first crime. It might have just been the first time they got caught. Even after sentencing, one question remains. Was this their first crime? Or just the first one they got caught for? What do you think? Are we really safe from people like this? Could there be more victims out there, hidden behind closed doors, waiting to be discovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe as we continue. The verdicts are in. Terrence Washington and Latonya Harris will never walk free again. But as the dust settles, the question remains, is justice ever truly enough? Because while the law may have punished the perpetrators, the scars left behind will never fade. Not for the victim, not for those who witnessed her suffering, and certainly not for a society grappling with how this could happen in the first place. Justice may have been served in the courtroom today, but for that little girl, the journey is far from over. She will carry these wounds not just on her skin, but in her heart, for the rest of her life. And the harsh truth is, there are more children out there right now, suffering in silence, just like she did. It's easy to believe that monsters like Washington and Harris are rare, that they exist in the shadows, far from the safety of our own communities. But the truth is far more unsettling. Every year, over 600,000 children are victims of abuse in the United States alone, and those are just the ones we know about. How many more are hidden behind closed doors? How many more are suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice? Could it be happening right now in your neighborhood? To someone you know? To someone you love? There were signs. There are always signs, but too often they go unnoticed, or worse, ignored. A neighbor hears screams but assumes it's nothing. A teacher sees bruises but hesitates to ask questions. A friend senses something is wrong but doesn't want to get involved. And in that silence, in that hesitation, monsters like Washington and Harris thrive. The question is no longer, how did this happen? The question is, how many more will it happen to? In the end, justice was served, or was it? Because the truth is, the scars from this case will never fully heal. And somewhere out there, another person like them is waiting, watching, planning. What do you think? Was justice truly served in this case? Or is there more to this story than we'll ever know? Have you ever seen signs of abuse that went unnoticed? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story has made you think twice about the world around you, share it. You never know who might need to hear it.